It's lesson 12, part 2. We're carrying on with unit testing with our .NET application. So we've set up our artist controller now to use dependency injection. We've got two controllers, one that accepts a mock object and one that accepts nothing as a parameter. That's our default. If we get nothing, we just use the database as usual. So now we want to go into our test class, and we want to set up for the ability for us to mock up data. The first thing we'll do is we need to reference mock. Installed mock as a dependency, either with the package manager console or with the NuGet, the GUI. So installed mock. So we're going to declare a few public variables here. Now, in the index test we wrote, we instantiated an instance of our controller. We're going to ultimately, to get close to 100% code coverage in the controller, we're going to need somewhere between 20 and 25 unit tests. So that's how many I'm going to expect you to have for your assignment for one controller. Whatever we do in class, you need to kind of do in the assignment. So that we probably can move this statement. Well, we'll partly move it. We won't instantiate the controller, but we'll declare it globally. So we don't have to redeclare it in every method. So I'll make a reference. I'll just artist controller. We'll declare it, but we won't instantiate it. So then I can take it. Actually, no, we can't instantiate it. What am I saying? Oh, no. Sorry. We'll just take that arrange statement right out. I'm going to instantiate it somewhere else, and I'll explain why. We're also going to create our mock here. So create a mock of type mock artists repository. That we'll call mock. It doesn't recognize our interface. Well, we just need to make a reference to the model's namespace, right? Because our interface lives in the models. So we're creating a mock object that's based on that interface we've defined of what an album is and can do. The last thing we'll need throughout this class is we need a list of mock album data. So we'll create a list, of artists that we'll just call artists. We're going to need all of these objects in all of our unit tests. So we'll just declare them globally in the class. No point redeclaring these same variables in every unit test. Waste of time. Now, we've declared the controller, declared the mock, but we haven't created or populated them yet. And we've never instantiated or made a call to our constructor. Right? So we have two constructors here. Which one are we going to call from our unit test? The constructor on line 20 or the constructor on line 26? Yeah, this is where we want to use dependency injection to call this, but pass in an instance of our mock that holds a bunch of kind of in-memory fake artist objects. So one of the other nice things this test suite has, and I'm sure JUnit has the same thing, is there's a built-in kind of method called test initialize. So it's like a startup method that will automatically be called before any unit test. So rather than instantiate the same controller over and over again, we can just put that in an initialize method. If we write 500 unit tests in here, they all call the initialize method first. So we give this method the decorator of test initialize. It doesn't matter what the actual method's called, as long as it has test initialize declared above it, it will run before every unit test automatically. And I typically just call this method test initialize. but it can be called anything. So runs automatically before each unit test. So we actually need to do 4 things in this initialize method. Before we do any unit test, we got 4 steps. What things do you think we need to do here? So before we can run this method, what do we want to do?
Initialize your controller.
Yep. Okay. That's going to actually be the last step. But yes, I'm going to put that in here. Thanks, Rick. So why would that need to be the last step, do you think?
Because we need to create a what do we call it? Unlock repository.
Right. And I'll say inject the dependency. Because if we just call the empty constructor, it uses the database. We need to send it the mock data. So what are we going to need to do?
Instantiate mock.
Yeah, so we'll need to instantiate the mock object. Yep, that'll probably be step 1. We need to instantiate something else. If you look at the variables up at the top. So instantiate the mock, that's the object from line 15. What else do we need to instantiate? Yeah, instantiate the list. So we got to create the fake data. We've got the mock, we've got the data. We just need to do one more thing before we call the controller and inject the dependency.
Find it.
Yeah, we have to stick the data into the mock. Right? We've got these 2 objects, bind them together. Those are our steps. And then that resulting, then our mock will now have a list of fake artist data, and then we'll call the controller and we'll pass it that mock object. We instantiate an instance of the mock. And we'll just populate a few dummy artists. We don't even have to fill all the properties, doesn't matter. We'll have to say artist ID equals 1. Fairly easy. Instantiate a mock and create a list with 3 kind of simple test objects. So now we want to bind them together. We want to populate the mock with our artists. But to do this, we use a method in the mock framework called setup. So our artists and we want to return this as a queryable object. If we just return the list of artists, we can't query it. We can't look at a particular element in it, which we need to do when we, for example, write our details unit tests. We need to get that list of 3 and then be able to identify a particular element. Now this throws an error, doesn't know what as queryable means. So we just need a reference to system.link. We've been using link all semester. We haven't really talked much about what it actually is. Link stands for Language Independent Network Query. So the idea that we can query a bunch of data, and it doesn't matter what the data source is, it's language independent. It could be from a database, it could be from a text file, it could be from an in-memory set of data, it could be XML, JSON. Link doesn't care. So we'll just reference system.link. And now we'll want to instantiate the controller and pass it our mock variable. So our controller equals new artists controller. And notice Visual Studio recognizes the overload, right? So the first overload is empty. That's going to call the database. We're not interested in that one. We're interested in this one. So we will pass it our mock. And it complains. So what is the issue here? The issue is it can't convert. It's just a type conversion problem. Now our mock holds a list of strongly typed objects, right? That album list, it's not just a generic list, it's a list of typed objects. So what we actually want is not just passing in the mock, we want to pass in the mock.object property. That exposes the actual data type inside the mock, whether it's artists, albums, genres, customers, or something else. It's a bit of a trick. It took me a long time when I was building this lesson to figure that out. I combed through that to try to figure out why I couldn't just pass in my mock. So now when we call our controller, our dependency injection should use our mock repository. It won't connect to the database when we're unit testing. That's the goal. So we could, actually, I could probably just run this with the debugger for a minute. If I put a breakpoint here, you don't have to do this. I'm going to see what happens if I try to run and debug my unit test. So test initialize should get called automatically before any unit test. Okay, so it goes in here now. So it creates a new mock, populates, and now notice which constructor gets called, right? So there's our dependency injection at work. It skips this constructor. It passes our mock list of albums to our second constructor. And now our DB is using our mock rather than our entity framework. So our setup is good. That's what we want. So we should write another unit test. This doesn't really affect, this test should still pass. So now our index view that failed before, because it tried to connect to the database, it now passes. Because we're no longer calling the version of the controller that requires a database connection. If we pass in a mock object, it just uses our mock repository. So the database never gets invoked. So we fixed this test, which was failing previously. It's now passing. Now we should probably write another unit test in addition to this one. Yeah, the view loads, but we should probably also check that when we call the index method, what we get back that inside of the view is a list of artist data. So let's write another test method for this, and then we can kind of evaluate our code coverage. So I'll say index loads artists. We don't need any arrange. The arrange is already kind of done for us here in the test initialize. We just want to act assert. We'll create a variable called actual. And what we want to check is that when we use our controller and call index, we actually want to evaluate the model, right? Because our view that gets returned has a model. If we open up views, artists, index, right? We've got this model. So that's the data that gets passed to the view. So that's what we're evaluating then in this case, right? When you call the index view, it returns a list of artists. That's what we're evaluating. So we want to call index and then say the actual is the model. That's our IEnumerable that comes back. Now it's complaining here because we have a bit of a casting issue. Our index method, the return type is action result. All of our scaffolded views return an action result, right? So action result, action result, action result. The problem is our model property, that's not a property of the action result class. It's a property of the view result class. And view result is a child of action result. It inherits from action result. So what we want to do is we want to first cast this as a view result. Then we can access the model property. So if we cast this as a view result, I think we need to do this. Sorry. Okay, so the code is right, but now it's making a reference error. I don't understand what a view result is, right? Or the model property of a view result. Because this is a unit test project that has no awareness of .NET MVC and the classes in the MVC framework. So if we just add this reference to system.web.mvc, my brackets aren't quite right. Bear with me for a second. There, sorry. So first cast this as a view result and then access the model property of that view result. So now what we want to assert in this case is we can actually do a collection assert. We want to check that our artists variable declared and populated in our initialize method is equal to our actual. Let's just see, bear with me for a second. Oops. No. Oh, I know what we need to do. Sorry. We need to do two casts. Once we get the model, we need to cast it as a list of artists. So we need one more list of artists. There. We're doing two casts from action result to view result. And then we access the model property of the view result, and then we're casting that to a list of artists. So in this case, when we're unit testing, if we pass in 3 fake artists, we should get back out 3 fake artists. It shouldn't be different. These lists should be the same. So let's build and try it out, see what we get. Okay, so all our tests pass. And we can have a look at where we got to with our code coverage. So I'll check. So I'll just do with the selected tests. All right, great. We're up to 2% overall. Woohoo! Let's see in our controllers. So in our artist controller, we're at 81%. But if you look, our index method is 100% covered. And our second constructor is 100% covered. The only thing that's not covered is the empty constructor. We don't want to unit test. You can't unit test that one because that one calls the database, which is an integration test and not a unit test. So it's okay that we don't get this first constructor unit tested. That's fine. I'm not going to penalize you if you're not at 100% coverage in your assignment. I expect that controller won't be covered. That's okay. Yeah, we want to unit test all the other methods. So that percentage will get higher as we add our other methods back in and unit test them. That percentage will get higher. It'll closer to 100. Right? Remember, we've commented out details, create, edit, and delete. So those are the unit tests I would expect you to have for index. You should have 2 tests, that it loads a view and that the data matches your mock list of data. So for example, Rick, you can just mock up a mock list of watches, put a few in, and make sure that index loads a collection of that type and that they're equal. So 2 tests for index. So let's deal with details. We'll unit test details and we'll call it a day. Okay. So we should go back to our artist controller. Let's uncomment the details method. Sean, have you got your toolbar now? So here's details. Now we have an error with it. And I will explain why, and we're going to need to make a small change. It says find doesn't exist on our repository, right? Our IMOC repository, it has no find method. It has a save and a delete, but it doesn't have find. Find exists, find works. It would work in right? And we have no find method here. Find works, it's part of entity framework, but it doesn't exist in our mock repository. So in order to get this to work, we're going to have to change this line. So instead of using find, we're going to use a link equivalent, because remember, link is a language independent. Doesn't matter if we're working with the entity framework or not. So instead of find, I'm going to comment this line out, and we'll rewrite it. I'll maybe put in a comment here. Original code for EF only. New code for EF or unit testing. If we want to get the details, we can still call db.artists, but we could use, for example, singular default instead with a lambda expression, a.artistid equals ID. This is language independent querying, so singular default will work with our mock repository as well as with entity framework. So that one change should allow us to unit test properly now. So again, we see where scaffolding gives us a good start, but we need to make some changes. So our details method, we should be able to compile now. Our code coverage will have dropped because we've now added a new method that is not unit tested. So if I check the coverage again, it should be below 80% now because we've got below 50, you think? Let's see. You might be right. Artists. Yeah, so now we're down to 32%, just enabling that one method. How many unit tests do we need for details, do you think? What would the possibilities be with details?
The same one, at least the first one that you did in the index.
Yeah, we could. So we could check that it just loads the view. So here are our possibilities, right? There's basically, I could see basically three possibilities. What are the three possibilities when somebody tries to call details? What could happen? What's one possibility? Sorry? Okay. And be a bit more specific. So one is, so a valid or invalid ID. Those are two different execution paths, aren't they? One is a valid ID, right? So something like details slash, in this case, well, for mocking, what would the valid, we're not working with real data, what would the valid IDs be?
One.
Yeah. So our URL will be details1, details2, or details3. So we'll need a unit test for this execution path. What would an example be? What value are we going to pass in for this unit test? Yeah, anything other than 1, 2, or 3. Yeah. If they just make a call to details with nothing. If we write 3 unit tests, this should, if we look at our method, this should handle all of the possibilities in our code, right? Let's go back to our details method. We've got 3 possibilities. ID is null, as Rick said. Well, we need to unit test this possibility, right? Artist is null. Sorry, we get an ID, but there's no match. So in this case, we do this. And the last scenario is we find a match and we return a matching artist object. So 3 unit tests should take care of this. I'm going to make one other small change here, because if you look at our web application code, when I click details right now, that we have it. We have details for artists. So if I click this link, I get the artist details. So this is what happens with the valid ID. Right now, if I put in an invalid ID, we go here. The other possibility is we could have loaded an error page. And if I go to details with no ID, so in our unit tests that we're going to write for invalid ID and null, we need to check that the index view loads, right? Because that's what our code is telling us to do. If there's not a valid ID, we're taking them back to the list of artists, right back to where they came from. So that's what our unit test needs to check. So we'll go back to our unit test class. Let's create our third test method. I'll call it details with a valid artist ID. You can call your unit tests whatever you want, but usually we name them by the first thing is what method are we calling, and some description that describes the condition we're checking or the scenario or execution path we're evaluating. So in this case, it's going to be similar to here, but rather than a list, right? What we're getting, we want to cast that result probably as a single artist, because we're getting one object rather than a list back when we call details. So we want artist, again, cast as view result, I think. Controller.details. We can pass in 1, 2, or 3. Those are our 3 valid IDs. Whoops, sorry. Yes. Thank you. So that should, there's our act. Call details, pass in a 1, cast it as a view result and get the model, and then cast the model as an artist. So our first parameter here is what we expect. What are we expecting? What variable? Not an album. Artists, right? Artists is our list. At what index? Right. The first one was artist ID 1. So we're expecting the first element in our mock to be equal to the actual. That's our expectation. If we pass in a list of 3 in the initialize, and then we call details on 1, it should return the first item in our array, position 0. So we'll run this test. and it passes. If I change this to say the second element in the array, it should break. Test should fail. If I put in artist1 or artist2, those two artist objects should not be equal. They'll have different values. So I'll run it again, and it should fail this time. Right? So it shows me that the two artists I get are not the same in this case. So let's see what that does for our coverage. So we're back up to 55. We were at 32 before we wrote the detail, when we enabled the details method. And it says we've covered 83% of the blocks in details. We just have to deal with those two other invalid scenarios. We have no ID, or we have an ID that isn't, we get a valid integer as an ID, but there's no match. So in this case, our act is going to be the same, but we're going to pass in a number other than 1, 2, or 3. Any other number will do. Actually, let's think about this for a minute. So I suppose say valid IDs 1, 2. So let's actually go and look at the method again for a minute. If we have an ID, so it's not null, so it skips over this section, it goes here. So if we get ID 4, when this code runs, right, our artist is going to be null. So what happens? What result should we expect if we pass in an ID that doesn't exist? Right. So what we should expect is we should expect that we get a view result, and that view result has the name. Right. So if we call it, we want to check what we're expecting to get back is a view named index. Or in this morning's class, we redirected, rather than index, we redirected to the error view. So we were checking that the view was called error. If you prefer that, then you can change your method to load the error page instead. So we're still going to cast this as a view result, but we don't need the model. There is no model in this that we're interested in. So we call details and pass in any number that isn't 1, 2, or 3. We don't need the model in this case. We expect the index view to load. No matching artist. So in this case, we're asserting that we expect value of index is going to be equal to the actual dot view name property. Right? We've cast the result as a view result, and we're checking that it's called index. If we got index, then we know our unit test should pass. That's the result we're going to expect if we pass in an ID that doesn't exist in the data set. So we'll build and run. Okay. Interesting. We got an error here. Why? Because our method is not returning a view result. It actually returns a redirect action. So view result is the wrong cast for us to be using in our unit test. We're not loading a view directly here. We're redirecting to another method. So rather than a view result, we're going to cast that as a redirect to root result. And now view name is not the right property anymore. What's the property we want?
URL.
Well, here, when I hit actual dot, yeah, I think let's try root name, gets or sets the name of the root. So it's actually the method that's being called by the redirect. It could be root values, but let's try root name. Let's see. Root values, what does that tell us? Gets or sets the root values. We'll try root name. It might be the root values property. Let's see. Let's run it again. Okay. So we expected index, root name is blank. Try root values. We may have to change one more thing in the controller. We'll try again. No, okay. Whoops, actual dot. Root name. But notice it's empty, which is odd. Let's see here what we need to do. Why is our root name empty? There's our action name. I mean, we could specify a value. We could specify some kind of like invalid value on the end of our URL. I'm curious why this comes back as blank. Let's have a look at this property for a minute. Let's see what's in here. That's helpful. The name of the root. Yes, I think we assumed that. Here's our problem. Redirect root result doesn't use the root name property. That's our challenge. There's root name. So this looks like a bit of a bug. Okay, maybe what we'll do for now, this root name should be here, but it isn't. So maybe what we'll do is instead of redirecting to this action, we will return the error view instead. If you try to load it, I think redirecting to index is a little more user-friendly, but we could load the error view and then we could check for that. Turn view. In this case, there's a default error view inside of views and shared. We don't have to specify the path. By default, when we return a view, the MVC framework looks for that name inside of the current controller. So it looks for artist's error. If it doesn't find it, it looks in the shared folder for a view with that name. But for now, we'll change it so it loads the error view. So now we'll have to modify our unit test to expect a view result rather than a redirect result. I will see if there's some way we can put that redirect back in and still access the name. But I may need some time to see. I'm not sure we've got a solution to that. So I will put this back in my unit test to a view result. But now we're actually looking. View name returned is error. So our return type is a view result. It's no longer a redirect. So if I put in an invalid ID in my browser now, we should get the error page rather than getting redirected back to the list of artists. Try my test again. So now it passes. If I pass in ID of 4, we get redirected to error. In my browser, if I put in an artist ID that doesn't exist, that's odd. I expected to get our error view. Maybe I just have to build. What is going on? Oh, if artist is null, didn't it load our error view? Oh, because I didn't put in details. So it loads the error view now when I put in an invalid ID. And it will do the same when I put in no ID. And now we just need one more unit test for this scenario. So our code coverage should improve. We're at about 50%, 50 some odd percent. After we added the first details unit test, we can check again here. Where we're at. So we're at 55%. So we're up to 83% within the details. We just need to deal with the scenario of no ID, and we should get full coverage in the details method anyway. So we're at 55% overall in the controller. So writing our last test should be pretty simple. Pardon? Yep. This should say expect the error view to load. Matching our artist. It will say no artist ID. We'll cast the result as a view result. Just pass in a null. And our condition is the same. We expect to get a view called error. Simple enough. We'll run this. Let's build and run it. And it passes. So we've got 8 unit tests. 3 of them are from the home controller. We don't even really need those. So for testing details and index, we should have 5 unit tests. So that's what I would expect in your assignment. 2 tests for index, 3 tests for details. If we look at the code coverage on those, we can see where we're at. Let me run that again for all tests. Hang on. That makes no sense. I think I had it running for selected tests, not all tests. So artists, right now we're at 92.5. Virtually the only thing that isn't covered is our constructor that uses the database. Well, we're never going to get that covered by a unit test. It's impossible. The only way to get that covered by a unit test is to add the connection string to our app.config so it connects to the database, which means it's not really a unit test because it connects to the database. So our other constructor is 100%, details is 100, and index is 100 now. So I'd like to see those 5 unit tests, which you could get started on in your assignment. You should be able to do the index and the details.
So for the assignment, we have to do the other ones too, right?
Yes, so we'll do those next week. And you do your assignment's not due for 12 days, right? So it doesn't have to be due. We still have, pardon?
It was due on Wednesday.
The following Wednesday, the last Wednesday. You have 12 days. So I'm going to push what we've done to GitHub. Doing the other tests shouldn't be terribly, they're a little more involved because the operations are a little more complex, but they'll follow the same pattern. So for edit, we'll have the same 3 possibilities, right? Valid ID, no ID, but we're also going to have get and post. What happens when we do a lookup to edit, and then what happens when we actually submit an update. Same with details, valid ID, invalid, etc. So I'll push our